Welcome, adventurers. Today on Rebel Then King, we're going to do another class analysis and sample build video pre-Player Core 2, this time looking at the Barbarian. Now, so far, I've sort of focused on classes like the Oracle and the Swashbuckler that I think need some somewhat decent or major improvements, and I don't think the Barbarian needs all that much. It is a simple, effective class that I have traditionally liked. It's a bit of a maybe more beginner skewing class because of its simplicity, but that's not to say that it is bad. But we'll take a look at the class, look at a few sample builds, see some of the strengths, and of course, minor weaknesses, minor qualms with the class in this video. Starting with the things that work well about the Barbarian. It is a simple and effective class. I mean, it's quite simple and it is quite effective. Its key action, Rage, is simple and not hard to understand. I think everyone gets it, both thematically and mechanically. You get mad and you hit stuff harder. That's what the Barbarian comes down to. This class is also single attribute dependent. It truly is a strength-based class. That's mostly all that you need, and as long as you have a good strength, you're going to have an effective Barbarian, compared to some of the other builds we've looked at where you really have to carefully manage your ability scores. Not the case here, though you do want to make sure you have some Constitution invested so that you gain some of the hit points and health and temporary hit points that is granted to you by Rage. And then technically you are just a medium armor user, which means that 1 point of dexterity does help you out, especially because, as we'll see later, you lose some of your armor class while raging. So there are some secondary ability scores you want to make sure you invest in, though truly I do consider this a single attribute dependent class. And then maybe it is a little too simple, I think, at times, especially when you get into Rage and the limitations on certain actions that you can take while raging. You might say at that point that it could get a little dull for some players, maybe. Let's talk about Rage, because I like to think about Rage when I go through it and just have sort of the pluses and minuses. A huge plus of Rage is there are no checks. It just works, and that is unlike Panache or Overdrive or Esoteric Lore. So that is a simple, effective. I mean, I'm just going to say that over and over about this class. It just works. It's simple. It's effective. It has a much lessened action tax, unlike Hunt Prey, where you have to hunt prey, or Esoteric Lore, where you have to Esoteric Lore on each creature that you want to apply extra damage to. I know there's some conditions for Esoteric Lore where that doesn't apply, but for the most part, you're going to have to make that check every time. That is not going to be the case with Rage. You just enter Rage and it applies for the entire combat. And in fact, this video is concentrating on pre-Player Core 2, but it does seem that in Player Core 2, Rage will happen on initiative, so there is no action tax on this anymore. That's fantastic. You get to add damage. That's what you want to do as a marshal, is add damage to your strikes, and it is static damage. It's not an extra d6 like some marshals do, which has the potential to be more and averages out pretty well, but a couple of bad dice rolls and you aren't doing so hot as a rogue or investigator that are doing that extra d6 of damage. Now to the negatives of Rage. It does lower your armor class and you are going to be front line, so you are going to get hit. But to sort of make up for that, you actually gain some temporary hit points while raging. That's equal to your level plus your Constitution modifier, which is why you want to make sure you do invest in Constitution as a Barbarian. And then you cannot take any actions that have the Concentrate trait as a Barbarian, which does limit the additional things that you can do in combat. But I think that's fine for the most part, because it is your role to hit things and hit things hard, so you shouldn't be spending too many actions trying to do other things. And I do want to emphasize that the damage that a Barbarian applies cannot be understated. You can drop lower level enemies with just a single hit. You can bring down a boss with a crit, and then you can often do a lot of damage despite resistances. I still remember playing as an alchemist alongside a Barbarian and going up against a swarm and thinking, aha, I will do so well in this encounter because I know that a swarm has a weakness to splash damage, and I can do that with my bomb. And I know that swarms are resistant to a lot of types of physical damage, so the marshals are going to struggle. I kid you not, the Barbarian consistently did more damage on their strikes despite resistances than I did triggering weaknesses, because the damage is just that strong. As far as improvements to this class, feat selection, especially at lower levels, there's a reason Sun Charge is used a lot. I do find it a bit hard to get excited about some of the Barbarian feats. You'll notice in the builds, I reuse some, so that could be improved. Subclass selection. There are quite a lot right now. We're only going to look at 4 in my builds because I don't want this to be a 2-hour video. When it comes to the different subclasses, each one does a slightly different amount of damage and different types of damage, and I find that it's nice that there's so much variation, but it can be a bit confusing and hard to remember. So maybe having something like a consistent damage but of different types or something like that could help out. I also always wonder about the balance between subclasses, and especially with Barbarian, it's like, is there any reason not to just play the Giant Instinct, which is by far the most popular, at least from what I have observed, because if you're going to have lower AC as a trade-off for hitting things really hard, you might as well lower your armor class just a little bit more and then stack on the most damage out of all the subclasses. It just sort of seems like an obvious choice. And then I also wonder about bonuses or allowances for other combat abilities, maneuvers, actions to take from the subclass to build in a little bit more variety into the subclasses themselves and into the gameplay. That being said, let's take a look at some builds now and try to understand how this class works in combat, outside of combat, what some of the feats and subclass options look like. We are starting with a human nomad animal instinct barbarian. This is a nomadic, lives on their own in the woods animal barbarian. So the background is nomad. As far as the ancestry, I went with a versatile human heritage so that I could pick up shield block and natural skill to round out some of the skills, because this is a slightly, I mean, not really, but slightly more skilled barbarian with regards to being outdoors and nature. I went with the deer animal as part of the animal instinct. So this is sort of a almost secondary subclass option just for this particular instinct. You are an animal instinct, that is your subclass, but then you have to pick which animal. And if we take a look here, there are a lot of animals to choose from. As far as what the animal instinct does, if you look at your bestial rage instinct ability, when you rage, you gain a chosen animal's unarmed attack. The specific attack gained, damage it deals, and its traits are listed on the table. So, I went with deer, and what does that do for us? We get antlers, which are D10 piercing, and they have the grapple trait on them. So in combat, this is not as hard hitting as other barbarian builds are. You are going to be doing a D10 from the antlers plus your 4 strength plus 2 from rage. That is the minimum amount of rage. Other subclasses rage damage, others add more than that. So it's not the hardest hitting, but you are going to have decent defenses with this, which is not always the case as a barbarian. You're going to get 3 temporary hit points while raging because of your constitution plus 2. And then, because I did equip this character with a shield and picked up shield block, if you raise that shield, first of all, your armor class goes up. And second of all, if you get hit with a steel shield, you're going to have 5 hardness on that, which means you should be able to absorb between your temporary hit points and the shield hardness 8 points of damage at level 1 before you actually take any damage. That's pretty big. As far as things that you can do in combat other than pierce things with your antlers, well, remember, you can use a lot of combat maneuvers here because the antlers do have grapple, which is nice in case you have something in the other hand, though by default, you're going to have your hands free because you're using your antlers on your head and a shield in one hand, so you do have a hand free for doing things like tripping in addition to grappling. You can shove and reposition too. As far as the class feats, I went with Sun Charge, which I feel like is the most commonly picked up Barbarian feat, but as a deer, it just makes so much sense, right? I mean, deer are kind of notorious for freaking out and charging into things, and that's what this is doing. At later levels, you can even pick up Bashing Charge and do some damage with it, which is cool. Also, at later levels, the antlers gain the Reach trait, which that's pretty vicious. I mean, to be able to strike and grapple and everything from range and then have these great movement abilities on top of everything is pretty nice. As far as being out of combat, I did invest in wisdom a bit here so that you have some of these outdoor survivalist skills, which are thematic to being a nomadic deer. We've got some nature, some survival, and some medicine. I could not afford healer's tools with this build due to having no weapons, but having lattice armor I went with, and then the steel shield, and then adventurers pack and stuff. So you'll pick up healer's tools presumably soon. And then just to review the ability scores on this build, maxing out strength, you are single attribute dependent. You always want maxed out strength. I did go +2 in wisdom, +2 in constitution for survivability, and that +1 of dex is sort of a persistent nagging thing that you do need with most barbarian builds. Because of using medium armor, you will need that little 1 point of dexterity to max out your armor class. But there we have our human, nomad, animal instinct barbarian. Now on to our dwarf refugee, who is a fury instinct barbarian. This is a dwarf who was driven out of their mountain home by orcs, which is why we went with the ancestry feat mountain strategy. Dwarves have a long history fighting common foes, and you've mastered the ancient tactics to better face these enemies. You gain a +1 circumstance bonus to damage with weapons and unarmed attacks against creatures with the giant, goblin, I can't say that word, Ringnar, I don't know how to pronounce that, or orc trait. Someone let me know how to pronounce that word, please. If your attack would deal more than one, blah, blah, blah. In addition, if any creature critically succeeds at an attack against you and deals damage to you, you gain your bonus damage against that creature for 1 minute, regardless of whether it has the chosen trait. Pretty cool. And then for heritage, I went with the Oath Keeper dwarf because I'm sort of envisioning this character being bound to return and reclaim the mountain fortress that they lost, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. It does offer some abilities outside of combat to us. As far as combat goes, I did go with the Fury Instinct just to sort of show off this instinct. It is, I think, a bit notorious for being a weak option. What you get out of being the Fury Instinct is an extra Barbarian class feat, and you get the minimum damage from Rage. For the class feats, I went with Raging Thrower, which is going to allow us to apply rage damage to our thrown weapons, in addition to melee weapons, and then Raging Intimidation, which actually comes additionally with Intimidating Glare. And this does allow us to demoralize while raging, which normally we couldn't do because Demoralize has the Concentrate trait on it. And then Intimidating Glare is great because then we can still demoralize things that don't speak a common language and not suffer a penalty to it. This Raging Intimidation, along with Sun Charge, which we looked at last time, I feel like are the most common two options. I think Raging Thrower is fun, but we'll talk about some of the downsides of it. As far as gear goes, let's just take a look at that. I armed this character with a hatchet, which will be our thrown option, and a great axe because, I mean, D12 weapon and being a dwarf. Scale mail armor, because it's fun. And let's look at details. Okay, so the great axe is going to be your primary weapon because it is D12, adds your full strength and +2 for rage. Though the hatchet is decent as well because it's thrown. It's a D6, but a D6 +4 from strength because you do get to apply your strength damage to thrown ranged weapons, +2 from rage. That's a pretty decent amount of damage for a ranged weapon. Usually ranged weapons don't apply any bonuses other than just the dice. So This is a good way for you to have a little bit of combat versatility and maybe take something out of the air or that's sitting up on a wall that otherwise would just completely frustrate a barbarian who wouldn't be able to hit it. And then if you pair that with Raging Intimidation, it's not a bad idea to open up combat by demoralizing, throwing, putting that free hand on your two-handed great axe, and then running in and doing damage. And then remember that due to mountain strategy, you can apply a little bit more damage, even depending on the type of enemy you're fighting or if that enemy critted you. So it does add up, but it's almost a subclass that is a little bit like being a fighter in a way, where it's just like, oh, here are feats. It doesn't really have that much flavor inherent to it. It's okay. It would be better if there were, I think, some more interesting feats. I guess we'll talk about those now. Acute vision, for example. When you are raging, your visual senses improve, granting you dark vision. Dark vision's cool, but some ancestries, like dwarves, you already have it. So, not helpful. Some of the others. Adrenaline rush. In the heat of battle, you are capable of amazing feats of strength. While you are raging, increase your encumbered and maximum bulk limits by 2. You also gain a +1 status bonus to athletics checks, which at first I get excited about, but then you read it's to lift heavy objects, escape, and force open. I don't know that I've ever lifted a heavy object or forced open anything in an encounter or seen any of my teammates do that ever. Escape, yes. Pretty infrequently, though. I also don't know that I've ever knowingly walked around encumbered or tried to pick something up in the middle of combat that would make me encumbered. So this feels like a feat that would get used a few times per campaign, max. Moment of Clarity. This is a decent one. You take a moment to clear your head so you can perform an action with the Concentrate trait. My only issue with this is that as a barbarian, I think it is your job to hit things. And if you're not using, I suppose with Moment of Clarity, you could clear your head, take an action, and then take one attack. But I would almost prefer always that a barbarian takes 2 attacks per round. And if Moment of Clarity is one action, you need another action to do something. With the Concentrate trait, you only have 1 action left. After that, it's not ideal. And then we've talked about the other 2. There are more depending on your instinct, but like the Draconic Arrogance is only available for 1 instinct. And Raging Intimidation we've already talked about. So that's it. There just aren't a lot of great feats for the Barbarian. And since the Fury instinct is based on feats, I think it suffers. Let's move on, though. I kind of already covered everything about the subclass. As far as exploration goes, the Oathkeeper Dwarf does give us a few bonuses to sense motive and other conversation-related activities, which is why I did go with the +1 charisma in the end here. So the ability scores are +4 in strength, +2 in dexterity, because you will need that for throwing, +2 constitution for your hit points, temporary hit points, and a little bit of charisma to help out with it, intimidation, and some of the charisma-based skills that come out of being an Oathkeeper Dwarf. All right, moving on. This one I like quite a lot. This would be the character that I would play if I was going to play a Barbarian right now. It is a Kitsune Chosen One Spirit Instinct Barbarian. This is someone who is convinced that they are the Chosen One, is kind of a religious zealot or religious figurehead in a way, that kind of switches between divine, schmoozy charm, and contemptuous rage. They are Darkfield's Kitsune, who picked up Kitsune lore. We'll talk more about Darkfield's Kitsune if you've watched, I think it was my Swashbuckler video. I used this same heritage because of its awesome reaction, Invigorating Fear, which I may overuse, but hey, I like it a lot. I armed this build with a Gizarm, and it has breastplate armor. So in combat, you're going to do a D10 damage with that weapon, plus your strength, +3 from damage, and that weapon has reach and trip. That's pretty fantastic. Now, this instinct, the spirit instinct, pre-player core tool 2 reads, you do increase your damage from rage from 2 to 3 and deal negative or positive damage instead of the normal damage type of your weapon or unarmed attack. I assume this will be updated to read Vitality and Void, but either way, I think this is quite good because this has a very good chance of just bypassing all resistances and even activating some weaknesses. You know, this would be fantastic for fighting the undead. So I think it is a pretty strong instinct to choose. 3 extra damage isn't as much as some others do, but like I said, there's that bypass or maybe even trigger weakness ability, so I think it is quite good. And then I again went with Raging Intimidation. That's just kind of what I'm doing here. It does make sense thematically for this build. You'll notice they have a +2 charisma because they are kind of a face of a new religious cult, basically. And when you combine that intimidation with Invigorating Fear says, a creature within 60 feet gains the frightened condition. You are invigorated by the shock of a prank or the thrum of terror. You gain temporary hit points equal to the creature's level or 3, whichever is higher. So you combine that Invigorating Fear reaction for 3 temporary hit points, plus the 3 temporary hit points you will get from Raging, and you have 6 temporary hit points, and presumably you can absorb 1 full, even decent blow from a pretty typical level 1 monster or level 0 or -1 monster that you would encounter as a level 1 adventurer and not need any healing afterwards. It's pretty good. Out of combat, you do have decent charisma and training in deception, diplomacy, intimidation, performance for being a bit of a party face as a barbarian. You know, it is possible. And then the prophecies pawn feat that comes with the Chosen One is quite fun. You fail a saving throw, attack, roll, or skill check. Re-roll the failed check. You must use the result of the second roll. Basically a free hero point. But for 24 hours afterward, the GM can force you to re-roll a successful saving throw, attack, roll, skill check to balance things out. That's pretty fun. As far as the ability scores, again, a +4 strength. Again, a +1 dexterity to max out your armor class. Again, a +2 constitution. And now a +2 charisma to be a bit of the party face. And now on to our last build, another human, AntiMagical, superstitious instinct, barbarian. This dude hates magic. Let's look at all of the ways this character is built to fight against magical creatures. First of all, with the superstitious instinct. While raging, you gain a +2 status bonus to all saves against magic. Okay? Now, what about the Witch Warden Ancestry feat? You gain a +1 circumstance bonus to saving throws against curses and to saving throws against spells cast by a witch or hag. Additionally, if you roll a success on a saving throw against a curse or a spell cast by a witch or hag, you get a critical success instead. And remember, it's a +2 status bonus and a +1 circumstance bonus. So in theory, if you were going up against a witch, that's a +3 on your saves, and you get a crit success on a success. So you don't go up against a lot of witches and spellcasters necessarily. They tend to be more of boss fights. But when you do, you will be in a really good spot against them because they're probably going to be targeting your saves, and you are going to have a huge benefit due to those 2 stacking bonuses. In combat, I armed this character with a great sword. It's going to be, D12 damage, +2 from rage, and then +2 from strength. Pretty decent. But due to the instinct, you will increase your damage from rage from 2 to 4 against creatures that can cast spells. Again, if you're going up against magic, you are going to do well. But also, again, you don't fight that many spellcasters, though certainly not none, so having 4 damage against them will be nice, especially when you consider that a lot of spellcasters, even NPC or enemy spellcasters, are on the weaker side of things. So that +4 damage, in addition to your +4 strength, in addition to your D12 sword, might take them out in one blow. You won't be surprised here to see that I, again, went with Raging Intimidation. because there aren't that many great Barbarian feats, if you ask me. Let me know if you think another feat makes more sense for this build. It's just sort of my default to go with because Demoralize is such a good combat maneuver. As far as the survivability here goes, I did not invest in dexterity because I took armor proficiency for this character. However, you can't really afford full heavy armor at level 1, so upgrade as soon as you can. It probably won't take too long. You're just a few gold pieces short, so an encounter or two, a little bit of loot, sell your current armor, your medium armor, and get some heavy armor and increase that armor class. Though you do have a +3 constitution for maximizing the amount of points, temporary hit points that you gain. And then another thing that actually comes from the superstitious rage is once every 10 minutes, when you rage, you regain hit points equal to the temporary hit points you gain from that rage action. That's regained, so you actually heal yourself by raging, and it's the same amount of temporary hit points from rage. So this sort of double encourages this particular build to go heavy into Constitution. If you weren't doing that as a Superstitious Instinct Barbarian, I would say you are doing it wrong. So that is why I do have a max +3 Constitution, maxed out Strength, a little bit of Wisdom, a little bit of Charisma to round this class out. As you can see, not a lot of skills trained here. I guess I get one more that I could have picked, but yeah, I think that's going to do it for this video. So as you can see, there are lots of decent options that are all going to work well with the Barbarian, but I feel like some are pretty clearly stronger than others. Again, Giant Instinct seems to be pretty hard for people to resist. Raging Intimidation also seems to be hard to resist. Did I take that on 3 of my 4 builds here? That's 1, 2. Yeah, I picked it in 3 or 4 builds. So having a bit more, not necessarily versatility, but viability in the class feats, I think is important. Both unifying and diversifying the subclasses a bit is going to help. I think there needs to be a greater reason to pick some of these other instincts. As you can see, there are a fair amount, but some of them just don't go used that often. Fury is one that a lot of people are pretty negative of, so improving that in some way I think could go a long way, but we'll see what Player Core 2 has in store for us. Until then, adventurers, remember, you can play your character however you want to do it. And you can do other things outside of just hitting things as a barbarian. But if you're not spending at least like 1 round per encounter just standing toe-to-toe with an enemy as a barbarian, raging and smashing away, I dare say you're doing it wrong.